This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Saturday visited Crimea and then the occupied port city of Mariupol. It was his first trip to Ukrainian territory that Moscow had illegally annexed in September. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma.
Putin arrived in Mariupol by helicopter and then, Russian reports say, drove himself around the city's so-called memorial sites, concert hall and coastline. In the Nevsky district, he met local residents in a video obtained from Russian sources exchanging pleasantries. Mariupol had become a worldwide symbol of defiance after outgunned and outmanned Ukrainian forces held out in a steel mill there for nearly 3 months before Moscow took control of it. The Crimea and Mariupol visits come days after the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader, accusing him of war crimes. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
The United States said it would be unacceptable if China were to position itself as a peacemaker in the war in Ukraine by promoting a ceasefire. This, according to White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. On Sunday, he spoke to Fox News Sunday.
All that's going to do is give Mr. Putin more time to refit, retrain, reman, and try to plan for renewed offensives at a time of his choosing.
Kirby's remarks come a day before Chinese President Xi Jinping heads to Russia to visit with his closest ally, Russian President Putin. The U.S. and its Western allies are deeply skeptical of China's motives, noting Beijing has refused to condemn Russia and provided it with an economic lifeline as other countries heap sanctions on Moscow. From Washington, this is VOA News. Banking giant UBS is acquiring its smaller rival Credit Suisse in an effort to avoid further market-shaking turmoil in global banking. This, according to the Swiss president on Sunday. The announcement follows the collapse of two large U.S. banks last week. The bank failures sparked a hasty response from the U.S. government to prevent any further bank panics. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Federal Reserve Board Chair Jerome Powell released a statement on Sunday saying they welcomed the Swiss announcement. At a news conference in Switzerland, the CEO of UBS Bank, Colm Kelleher, was asked if there was any chance that UBS might back out of the deal.
We are committed to making this deal a great success. There are no options in this. This is absolutely essential to the financial structure of Switzerland and, at the risk of being somewhat global, I think to global finance. So this deal is announced. This deal will be executed successfully.
Donald Trump has called for protests as he predicts his arrest on Tuesday, while his former vice president calls the investigation political. AP correspondent Julie Walker.
Former Vice President Mike Pence says with all the problems in New York, the Manhattan DA doesn't need to investigate hush money payments to women who allege sexual encounters with Trump.
It just feels like a politically charged prosecution.
Trump has said he expects to be arrested Tuesday and is calling for protests.
The American people have a constitutional right to peaceably assemble.
The former vice president also says people are frustrated about
what they sense is a two-tier justice system in this country. I think is well-founded.
Pence made his comments on ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos during a visit to Iowa, an early voting state, and said he's giving serious consideration to running for president. Julie Walker, New York.
The Islamic State terror group on Sunday claimed responsibility for an attack that took place in an eastern village in the Democratic Republic of Congo, killing 10 people and injuring many others. The claim was made on a Telegram account associated with the group. It said this attack represents an expansion for IS operations. Sudan's military leaders and pro-democracy forces vowed to begin establishing a new civilian-led transitional government on April 11th. This is according to a spokesperson representing both parties on Sunday. Speaking at a news conference broadcast by Sudan's state-run Suna news agency, Khalid Omar said a finalized political statement, first agreed upon last December, would be inked on April 1st, and a new transitional constitution would be signed days later. Two International Committee of the Red Cross employees kidnapped in early March in northern Mali were released Sunday evening. This, according to the ICRC, making its announcement on Twitter. I'm Marissa Melton, VOA News.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has arrived in Moscow on a 3-day visit that offers a strong political boost for Russian President Vladimir Putin as his fighting in Ukraine grinds on. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
China and Russia have described Xi's visit as part of efforts to further deepen their no-limits friendship. The Kremlin's welcomed China's peace plan for Ukraine and says it will be discussed during Putin-Xi talks over dinner on Monday. Beijing has called for a ceasefire, but Washington strongly rejects the idea as the effective ratification of the Kremlin's battlefield aims. China looks to Russia as a source of oil and gas for its energy-hungry economy and as a partner in opposing what both see as American domination of global affairs. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
European Union countries on Monday agreed to a €2 billion plan to send 1 million artillery rounds to Ukraine over the next year by digging into their own stockpiles and teaming up to buy more shells.
The answer of the Council was clear. Ukraine can continue counting on the European Union.
EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, whose approved plan is to spend €1 billion on shells from stockpiles to get more supplies to Kyiv soon and $1 billion more on joint procurement. A top United Nations panel of scientists said Monday humanity still has a chance, close to the last one, to prevent the worst of climate change future harm. That's requires quickly slashing carbon pollution and fossil fuel use 60% by 2035. The United Nations chief said it more bluntly, calling for an end and countries quitting coal, oil, and gas by 2040. This is VOA News. The European Commission said Monday it will support Turkey with €1 billion to help with reconstruction in the aftermath of the deadly earthquake that devastated parts of the country and struck neighboring Syria last month. VOA's Diane Roberts has more.
Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU's executive arm, also pledged €108 million, or $115.7 million, in humanitarian aid for Syria.
Millions are now homeless and living in tents as the winter drags on. We need to sustain our support and help the survivors, not just to survive, but to rebuild their lives.
The magnitude 7.8 earthquake on February 6th killed more than 52,000 people, the vast majority of them in Turkey. Diane Roberts, VOA News.
U.S. President Joe Biden's administration says an American aid worker kidnapped in West Africa more than 6 years ago has been freed. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
In 2016, gunmen took Jeffrey Woodke from his home in Niger, where he'd been doing humanitarian aid work for more than 30 years. Officials believe Woodke was moved over the years into Mali and Burkina Faso. While the administration's thanking Niger's government for helping free Woodke, a senior official would not say exactly what led to the release or where Woodke is now, but that there was no ransom paid nor any concession to Woodke's captors. Sagar Magani, Washington.
The United States has determined all sides committed war crimes during the conflict in northern Ethiopia that killed tens of thousands of people, left hundreds of thousands facing hunger, and displaced millions, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday. Blinken said that after a careful review of law and facts, the State Department determined the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Eritrean Defense Force, and forces loyal to the Tigray People Liberation Front and regional forces from Amhara committed war crimes during the conflict. As another spring break descends on southern Florida's Miami Beach, another curfew is being enforced following 2 deadly shootings. AP correspondent Julie Walker reports.
The curfew was overnight Sunday after the weekend's deadly shootings, and Mayor Dan Gelber says they want another one next weekend. A deadly Friday night shooting near Ocean Drive and another in the wee hours of Sunday sent people fleeing. Gelber says over the past 3 weeks, 70 firearms were seized.
We don't want spring break in our city. It's too rowdy, brings too much disorder, and is simply too difficult to police.
Last year, Miami Beach also imposed a curfew following 2 shootings. I'm Julie Walker.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Russian President Vladimir Putin said after talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping on Tuesday, Chinese proposals could be used as the basis of a peace settlement in Ukraine, but the West and Kyiv were not yet ready. Putin accused Western powers of fighting to the last Ukrainian after talks with Xi in the Kremlin, which Putin said showed the growing trade, energy, and political ties between China and Russia. Describing his talks with Putin as, quote, open and friendly, Xi reiterated China's neutral position on Ukraine and called for dialogue. Asia's stakes in Europe's war were made crystal clear when the leaders of the region's two richest countries sat in the capitals of Russia and Ukraine in strong shows of support for the opposing sides. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma explains.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida paid a surprise visit to Kyiv on the other side of the front lines. The visits come as tensions grow between the two regional rivals and top economic powers. China's seeking to expand its influence, and Japan has responded by increasing its defense spending and deepening ties with the US and its allies. While Xi's trip is meant to send a message to the West that its efforts to isolate Moscow over the invasion of Ukraine have fallen short, Kishida in Ukraine strongly underlines the global nature of the opposition to the war. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
The U.S. Defense Department says it's speeding up its delivery of Abrams tanks to Ukraine, opting to send a refurbished older model that can be ready faster. The aim is to get the 70-ton battle powerhouses to the Russia-Ukraine war zone by the fall. The original plan was to send 31 newer M1A2 Abrams, which could have taken a year or two to build and ship. This is VOA News. Many South Africans stayed home from work Monday as a political party called for a nationwide shutdown to protest frequent power cuts and high unemployment. Jan Borman reports for VOA from Johannesburg.
The shutdown, called for by the Radical Economic Freedom Fighters Party, ended Monday with small and isolated incidents of public violence and the arrest of at least 550 people across the country. The party's leader, Julius Malema, had called for businesses to close and people to stay home to protest record unemployment and ongoing power cuts. The party also called on President Cyril Ramaphosa to step down immediately. Although most businesses closed in Johannesburg and Pretoria, some observers questioned whether the protest was a success because it was held on a day many would have taken off anyway, ahead of a Tuesday public holiday. Jan Borman for VOA News, Johannesburg.
The governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea on Tuesday angrily rejected U.S. claims their forces had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity during the devastating two-year war in Tigray. Ethiopia's foreign ministry branded the allegations made by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday as partisan and inflammatory. Several hours later, the Eritrea foreign ministry issued a statement describing them as unsubstantiated and defamatory. Paris's iconic Notre Dame Cathedral was heavily damaged by fire 4 years ago, but soon the base of the new spire is to be built, and officials hope to reopen the cathedral by the end of next year. From Briey, France, where the work on the spire is being done, Lisa Bryant reports.
More than 20 craftsmen, hundreds of hours, and thousands of trees. That's what it takes to rebuild just the base and the spire of Notre Dame. Carpenters are rushing to finish the base. The spire itself is planned to be up by year's end. Notre Dame's reopening promises to be a global celebration. But for these workers, it will be bittersweet. The end of years of hard work and an extraordinary adventure. Lisa Bryant for VOA News, Briey, France.
Nigeria's opposition Labour Party candidate Peter Obi has filed a petition seeking to cancel results from last month's disputed presidential election. Court papers showed, kicking off what could be a long legal campaign lasting several months. There have been numerous legal challenges to the outcome of previous Nigerian presidential elections, but none has succeeded. Obi asked the appeals court to invalidate the election won by Bolo Tinubu of the ruling party, accusing the Independent National Electoral Commission of breaching the law by failing to use electronic machines to upload polling station results. I'm Joe Ramsey.
And Novak.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Russia blasted an apartment block in Ukraine with missiles on Wednesday and swarmed cities with drone attacks overnight. Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman reports.
A display of force as President Vladimir Putin bid farewell to his visiting dear friend and Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. Security camera footage captured the moment a Russian missile slammed into the side of an apartment building in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. Flames explode from the blast, followed by plumes of smoke as pedestrians flee in terror. The bombardment came as Xi wrapped up his visit to Moscow. Hosting Xi this week was Putin's grandest diplomatic gesture since he launched the war a year ago and became a pariah in the West. The two men referred to each other as dear friend, promised economic cooperation, condemned the West, and described relations as the best they have ever been.
Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the Eastern Front Line on Wednesday, meeting with troops and giving awards to servicemen. He said, I started from the front, from the Bakhmut area. It's an honor for me to support our soldiers who are defending the country in the toughest frontline conditions, Zelensky said in the evening video address. He added that it's painful to look at the cities in the Donetsk region, to which, quote, Russia has brought such terrible suffering. Ukrainian forces have held out for about 8 months in Bakhmut, despite taking heavy casualties in one of the bloodiest battles since Russia's full-scale invasion 13 months ago. Former U.S. President Donald Trump appeared unlikely to face criminal charges on Wednesday after a law enforcement source said a grand jury investigating alleged illegal hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels would not meet again before Thursday. Follow us on the VOA app. This is VOA News. Malawi's president is appealing for additional humanitarian assistance for thousands displaced by Cyclone Freddy, which has killed more than 500 people in the country. Lamek Messina reports from Blantyre.
Malawi President Lazarus Chakwera told the lawmakers that although the country is receiving a lot of local and international assistance for the victims, more aid is needed.
The supplies we are deploying are far from enough for the magnitude of the need.
Malawi's Disaster Management Affairs Department says there now are upward of 500,000 people who have been displaced, living at 534 camps. Lamek Messina for VOA News, Blantyre, Malawi.
French President Emmanuel Macron drew an angry response from unions and opposition parties on Wednesday when he said he would press on with his unpopular plans to raise the pension age. Reuters correspondent Gillian Kitchener reports.
In his first public comment since pushing through the bill, Macron said in a televised interview he was undeterred.
Donc, oui. And so this reform is necessary. And I say this to the French people. I don't enjoy doing this. I would have preferred not to do this.
On Wednesday, protesters blocked train stations. In Nice, an effigy of Macron was laid on the tracks and thrown into the air. Polls show a wide majority of French are opposed to the pension legislation, and the past 6 nights have seen fierce demonstrations across France with bins set ablaze and scuffles with police.
Reuters correspondent Gillian Kitchener. Nearly 200 years after Ludwig van Beethoven's death at the age of 56, researchers are searching for clues about his health problems. The AP's Ed Donahue reports.
The legendary German composer had hearing problems and severe stomach ailments. A new study says chronic drinking may have been a factor. Researcher Tristan Begg at the University of Cambridge says they couldn't figure out what caused Beethoven's hearing loss.
That seems to have had an onset in his mid to late 20s. It was a slowly progressing form of hearing loss that appears to have been nerve-related.
Losing his hearing is believed to have limited Beethoven's creative work. Researchers pulled genetic clues from locks of Beethoven's hair that had been snipped off and preserved as keepsakes. I'm Ed Donahue.
Boris Johnson said hand on heart he did not lie to Parliament over rule-breaking COVID-19 lockdown parties as the former British Prime Minister fought for his political career at a hearing with lawmakers on Wednesday. Follow us on the VOA mobile app or online at voanews.com. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA News.